are also joining online from the officer side, so thank you very much for joining us. Before we start, just apologies for absence, please. West.
Chair, there's no apologies received for this evening.
Okay. Item number 2 is declarations of interest. Does anyone have any declarations to raise? Okay. First of all, Councillor Alta Khan, yes, please.
I don't think it's interest, but I would like to put this on record that I am a member of Planning Committee as well as Scrutiny Committee. So although we're not looking planning application, we are looking a cabinet report and they're scrutinizing. So, and I'm a former student of Ruskin, which doesn't exist anymore. It's a West London University now, but we still call it Ruskin.
Thank you for noting that. Emma, please, online, could you just clarify the situation on that? Please?
Yeah, it's not an interest, so there's no problem, but you will just need to take care, Councillor, when it comes to the planning application and in terms of what you say tonight, in terms of seeming to form any views. So just as a piece of advice.
Thank you, Emma. We also have one of our speakers who is Councillor Ros Smith, who's raised her hand. I just want to clarify, do we take that as you, because you're not a committee member, then it's not noted as an interest. So just to thank you. And from Councillor Diana
Regisford, yes.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm also on planning committee. Just so the same applies probably.
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's well noted. And I'd like to, just for the record, note that I supported the call in on this, but I'm not, this is not relevant, I don't think, for the discussions tonight. Thank you. Okay. So then, if there's no further declarations of interest, so chair's announcements, I don't have any. So then we will proceed to item number 4, which is the consideration of a call-in request relating to this cabinet decision on the disposal of land of Foxwell Drive, Headington. There are a couple of things I just want to note to the committee before we start, and that is that there are going to be some documents in your pack which are sensitive and restricted, and therefore if we do get to a point where we are discussing those items, we will need to go into confidential session. So just to note that. We have 2 public speakers who are here, who I'm going to call up in a moment. Just a reminder to everybody that we're on live stream at the moment. The exempt items will be not live streamed for obvious reasons, and we will stop that when we get to that stage. Please use the microphones if you're speaking, and on those online, camera on where possible and mute when not speaking. So I think at this point, I'm going to invite up our first speaker, who is James Malcolmson, who I believe is the chair of Friends of Headington. And I'd like to invite you to speak your submission, please. Thank you very much. Welcome. Sorry. The little speaking button there.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's Jim Malcolmson. I'm chair of the trustees of the Friends of Old Headington. I did send in an outline of my contribution that I sent to Celeste, but I gather that hasn't been circulated to councillors. So I shall have to just summarise that. I'll try and do it as briefly as I can.
You're very welcome just to read it out in it full. That's absolutely fine.
Well, I thought I would just say some things and then invite questions from people if that would be helpful.
Just to clarify, can we, from the officer, no, I'm afraid we're not allowed to take questions
okay.
in terms of the constitution, but you're welcome to read it out. So okay. And we'll just take it as read. Thank you.
The Friends of Old Headington have 4 areas of concern about this potential option agreement. that it may not have been given sufficient scrutiny in our view when the Cabinet approved this. The whole item at the Cabinet discussion was less than 2.5 minutes, of which more than 1.5 were the presentation by the officer proposing it. There were no questions asked, and that's recorded in the minutes of the Cabinet meeting. We don't know whether these questions were covered under the confidential documents that were circulated, because we haven't been allowed to see the confidential documents, hence our concern about this. The areas of our concern are, firstly, whether the council should have consulted about the sale of what's effectively public open space at the end of Foxwell Drive that's covered by the option agreement. There's a forest, it's a tiny forest, I think it's called tiny forest or community forest, that's supported by the council there. And it looks to us, though we can't see the details, that any access going through that location would go through that forest. It's an area of public recreation for residents of Foxwell Drive and around. And so it seems to us it's effectively public open space, and it would be appropriate for the council to have consulted with the public about it. The second item is that there are two things in the risk register that we were given access to concerning the agreement, which were completely unclear to me and I think should be made transparent. One was when the option agreement would actually be signed, because the suggestion in the risk register is that that would only happen when Ruskin College has sold the land. I didn't know whether that was actually true or whether it was described appropriately. The second was that under risk 3 planning delays, it gives us a control mitigation factor that the agreement allows the council to object to the details of any planning application before it's submitted. But there's no specification of what constitutes details or what the implications of such an objection would be. And it's not even clear who the council is in this context, because presumably at any stage, planning committee, when a planning application is submitted, can make its decision about anything. So it seemed to me it needed some transparency about who in the council can object and what they can object about before an application is submitted. The third item concerns a potential conflict of interest. I mean, if the council officers have done a good job, the council will be due to get a substantial sum of money for signing the option agreement up front, and even more if planning were to go ahead. So you don't need me to tell you that there's a lot of concern in the city. You only have to just look at the Oxford Mail to see how citizens are concerned about the impartiality of planning application decisions when the city has some financial involvement in this. So there's a lot about that. And it just seemed to me very important that it should be clear how this conflict of interest would be handled and how any appearance of a conflict of interest is going to be handled, so that the citizens are absolutely sure that these decisions are made in an appropriate way. And the final issue we're concerned about with respect to the option agreement, there would be other things we'd object to in any planning application, but I'm concerning myself here with the option agreement. Although the Oxford Local Plan 2040, which I'm not quite sure of its status now, but I gather it's been withdrawn in some way, did not allocate the fields immediately for which this access agreement would apply as a site suitable for housing development. An option agreement would certainly be used by the developers to make a case for changing that in the plan. Indeed, they've already have done. After the plan was drafted, before the inspectors spoke about it, they, on the 4th of January 2024, they wrote to the planning policy team saying that they are finalising an option agreement to secure access rights over City Council land, linking Foxwell Drive with the fields, so that they've already tried to get the plan changed, making the case that this option agreement is a reason for trying to do that. So that's one concern. And the Friends of Old Headington are also concerned that if the city seems to have a conflict of interest when an inspector comes to look at the plan, there will be like an ambivalence. If the plan, even if the planners decide not to allocate this land, there will be a concern that the city is looking ambivalent about it. And finally, there's a concern that the more things that are added onto this, the more planning blight there is for that area of Foxwell Drive, the more it looks like it's going to go ahead. And that's an area which has already suffered somewhat from the access of buses through from Barton Park. And this will presumably threaten much more traffic coming through if it goes ahead. So what we would like to have happen is that before there's any proceeding to negotiate this option agreement, that the heads of terms that have been discussed should be made public with any monetary amounts redacted. I consulted an extremely senior planning expert who said that if the monetary amounts are withdrawn, there can't really be any issue about commercial confidentiality. This is somebody I would give you the name, except that he's been in hospital and I haven't asked permission to speak his name in public. So, but I can assure you it's somebody extremely senior in the planning world. That's the first thing we would want. The second thing we would want is that if the agreement is negotiated, that before it's actually approved by the city, that again, it should be made public with any monetary amounts redacted so that it's not suffering from commercial confidentiality. And the third conclusion we think is appropriate is that actually it would make much more sense to wait until after the local plan is approved and we know whether these fields to which this access would be given, whether they are actually considered to be appropriate for housing development or not, and negotiate the issue of access only if the local plan approves that, rather than blighting everything on the way. So we just think it'd be much more appropriate to negotiate at that point. So those are the points I want to make.
Thank you very much, James. We appreciate that. Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to invite up our next public speaker, who is Councillor Ros Smith. Just note, Councillor Smith was also the member that supported the call-in. Councillor Smith, when you're ready.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I'm a bit nervous about this, I have to say, because this is the first time that I've ever done a call-in for a cabinet decision. But it's not a decision I took lightly, make the call-in. And I feel also that I ought to just mention that I am a trustee for Oxford Preservation Trust, which owns some land the other side of the University of London's, West London's fields as such. It's being discussed as such this evening. Right. So when I presented my, sent in my call in back on the 22nd of October this year, I gave some reasons for the call in. One was loss of open space. The second was loss of the nature corridor. The third was the length of time for the option agreement that had been given, and a conflict of interests and risks not considered in full that actually need further scrutiny. Mr. Malcolmson this evening has outlined quite a lot of the things that I was concerned with regard to this, my objection and call in for this particular cabinet decision. But there are a few things that I would like to highlight as well too. There seems almost to be an amber light for the developers with this particular decision. And I wonder if the council has got a duty to get the maximum value. obviously for the land, but I think we might have to go into confidential to look at those particular aspects. Regarding the risks that are not considered in full, loss of open space. One of the council's priorities, in fact, it's the second priority under your zero carbon Oxford strategy. The second priority reads, maintain and improve parks, green spaces, biodiversity, and access to nature. Now, this falls in line with my first 2 points for calling, loss of open space and loss of the nature corridor as such. As James has mentioned earlier on, the good folks of Northway and Foxwell Drive have already suffered quite a lot of nature loss with regard to the junction that was put in for the bus gates and things, and they are seeing a lot more traffic through there. If this goes ahead, we see a lot more traffic as well from any development that would be agreed. But again, that's some dates in the distance, and we don't know even if that will be approved into the local plan. I think it is important actually to highlight, though, this loss of open space and green areas, particularly as it is part of the Oxford strategy as well, quite clearly that you're going to maintain and improve. And indeed, there has been some improvement to this space, Chair and committee members. There is a lovely little wood that has been planted not long ago, and I went down there today to have a look at it again. The seedlings and the trees that have been young trees that are put in are taking root as such, and actually providing a lovely green area and somewhere for local people to go. That is very important. We all know the importance of having green spaces. The other thing I wanted to mention again was a risk, and I think it's a risk of reputation for the council. I'm sure you're probably, well, perhaps you're not aware of the gunning principles. I don't know, looking around the table, people are aware of the gunning principles with regard to consultation? Perhaps not some of the new councils. There are 4 to it, but it is something that is in the Local Government Association Guide to Engagement. And I think it's important that this important decision, and it is an important decision for local people, that you've got to give sufficient time to local consultation, even if you don't have to legally consult locally. I think the council almost has a moral duty to support a consultation locally for this particular thing, and to be open and transparent with regard to the terms of heads of terms agreement that is being offered to this one organisation. Only one organisation. Is that in fact actually a risk? It hasn't been mentioned actually as a risk that only offering it to one organisation. It could be that somebody else would actually like to take on that piece of land and possibly develop it further as a nature reserve, or possibly something else, not necessarily housing. Now, Chair, you will know that I am not against housing. In fact, I'm very aware that we have people on our waiting list in Oxford City desperate for a decent home. But I think we have to balance that with the cost of the loss of nature. I really do, and of this nature corridor. It's not a large piece of land, but it is very significant. It's on a very sharp bend in Foxwell Drive. I don't know if members are aware of that area, but it is on a very sharp bend, and I think that needs to be taken into consideration if it ever got sold. I'm very happy to take questions if there are any members from yourself or any other members. Okay.
Thank you very much, Councillor Smith.
Thank you.
And just to clarify on the questions, I'm afraid
She's not a member of the committee, she won't be able to pose questions here.
yeah, that is not a member of this committee. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to pose questions to you, but we thank you for your time.
Okay, fine.
And
right, and I would just like to end then by saying I do support the requests from Mr. Malcolm this evening. I concur with all of those. I think they are very important. But I would also ask that the council considers through this scrutiny committee, and ask the cabinet to consider about the risk to reputation if you don't do a local consultation on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, Councillor Smith. Thanks. Thank you. Okay, so at this point, because we're going to first of all talk about what's in the public domain. Then our speakers and guests can stay in the room. At this point, I understand that we've got Jane Winfield, who is going to present the report, and Ted Bowler as well. Councillor Turner sends his apologies. He may join us in due course. So, Jane, can we come over to you and Ted?
Actually, Ted's going to present the report. Apologies on behalf of Councillor Turner. Ted, have you got anything to say? I'm assuming it will be very short.
I think we cover most points in the report, and I'm not sure I can add anything further other than to read it out, I'm afraid.
So I think we take the report has been read, digested, and I think probably we need to move to questions, but we just need to be very careful about when we're in confidential session and when not. And I think on that basis, Emma probably needs to give her advice.
Thank you. So Emma, do step in if some of the questions that we receive from the floor do verge on us needing to go into confidential session. Are you happy to do that? Yes.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Great, thank you very much. So in which case, then I'll open to the committee. Do you have any questions for officers? I can see Councillor Altaf Khan does, and Councillor Artino as well. Any from this side? Okay, we'll go to Councillor Khan first. Thank you.
Okay, I got a number of questions and I wanted to some of clarification from officers as read the report. There was not much a presentation, so I'll ask specific questions. As the report says, and first, sorry if I address some of the other issues. There are two things here we're talking about. One related to planning, which we're not discussing at this stage. And the other is about the dispose of this land. And as there is some confusion about the overlap or conflict planning and dispose of land. So I assume one of officers can clarify that the planning process itself will run along the separate way. It hasn't got anything to do with this. Any application, whether it's a council land or somebody else's land or nobody's land, anyone can put an application, and the application go through the planning process. So I'm sure there's nothing looking different here than the normal process will prevail. Dispose of this land and with the conditional for the planning, that's something is a bit of concern, because if city council wants to sell off this land or access to the Ruskin, then why you attach a condition for planning? Because whoever buy land or attach to Ruskin, it's up to them whether they put planning or not. It's nothing to do with the city council. So then city council should, as a cabinet or executive, should stay away from that and just talk about the disposable of this land. And this land could have been some other conditions or other options not directly relating to the planning. So somebody can that clarify. And the other, which it says here, is this optional agreement, which is not drafted yet. So this report is already with the scrutiny, is already been cabinet and now scrutiny, and I believe the cabinet decisions will go back to the full council, where all the members have another chance to ask questions at the full council. But how you are asking question or trying to debating this, as you haven't got the full optional agreement in front of you, you don't know the detail of the optional agreement. So that's a bit of a sort of in very much few things are in air. I do understand, as one of the speakers said, about the need of housing and the council maximizing their land and their uses that could be for different uses. So this whole process doesn't make very clear. It makes very if and buts. If this happened, then this, then that. So I think that's needed to be a bit more firm clarification.
Thank you. Thank you. So we've got 3 points there. We will come to Councillor Ortino, but first of all, just to Emma Jackman, because I think there's a question from is this a clarification from a law and governance
So
perspective?
I was going to just respond to some of the points that have been raised, but I can do that whenever is convenient.
Okay, let's we'll come back to you in a second, if I may, and we'll go to Councillor Ortino, and they'll take everything together just for efficiency's sake. So Councillor Ortino, you had some points as well, which may overlap to the 3 points from Alta.
Yeah, am I right in saying that there is no planning application at the moment, but if there were to be one, there will be full consultation with the public, and it will be follow through all the normal procedures of planning. So there's no doubt that there will be consultation on that matter. Am I also clear that there are several occasions when one part of the council may be involved in a planning application, such as Ox Place wanting to build their own properties, and the council is fully confident in its own planning officers that they are able to separate themselves and do an utterly professional job in assessing a planning application. And not only that, the members of the planning committee are also capable of doing that. Am I right in saying that's true? And lastly, in terms of the option agreement, surely that has been necessary both for the buyer and the seller, in that the value of the land is uncertain, I suppose. So the buyer would not want to spend more money than is necessary on this land, but the seller, i.e. the council, wants to maximise the potential earnings for it for the benefit of us all. Is that the correct understanding?
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Ortino. So we've got a number of points there. So there's this overlap of planning and disposal of land from Councillor Khan, the condition of planning, and then the option agreement. How can it be debated if it's not fully drafted, or we've got full oversight? And then Councillor Ortino's point around this, again, this consistency between the full planning consultation on what's proposed versus what we're discussing with the option agreement, and how the council separates its planning and its corporate property processes. Yeah, over to Emma first of all to respond, and then any of the other officers as well, please. Thank you.
Okay, as Councillor Tina has just pointed out, the reason that it's been sold with a planning condition attached to the option, that's very common in transactions of this type. I think I can only see the public speakers. Sorry, I don't know if the microphone's been left on. But just to say, but sorry, so yes. So it's attached because obviously what a buyer won't want to do in any situation where they've got ideas for a piece of land is be committed to purchase it if they can't carry out those ideas, if that makes sense. So I'm not talking about this specifically, but generally. Likewise, in terms of the seller, what the seller won't want to do is sell it for a lower price when actually with planning permission it could realise a far greater at the sale price. So they're the reasons that such conditions are very frequently used in option agreements. In terms of planning separation, the council routinely undertakes determination of planning applications that are submitted either by the council or by a council-connected entity. The planning officers are professionals, they're regulated by their own professional body, and we have governance arrangements in place that ensure a significant and robust separation of powers function. So, for example, when it is a planning discussion, only planning officers will be there. The only extent to which they'd speak with officers on the developer side would be where they would speak to the developer side in normal circumstances. So there's no preferential treatment. However, in this case, the council will not be the developer. There's no distinction. The council won't have the input into the planning application. It won't be bringing forward the planning application. There won't be the discussion with the council officers. In terms of the option agreement not being drafted yet, it is always the case that reports to council, cabinet, any committee that concern any sort of agreement do not append the draft agreement. Ordinarily, it's extremely technical and requires detailed negotiation. And what we seek up front is the agreement to enter into it and then delegated to officers to negotiate those terms. It's not ordinary that the details of commercially based and legally based agreement would be debated. The heads of terms were provided to Cabinet in the exempt papers. They're provided to Scrutiny today in the exempt papers. That is as far as it's got. There will be a negotiation process to get to the point where an agreement is ready to be signed, subject to obviously Cabinet confirming their decision on this one. That is very ordinary. And so really what the role of Cabinet and Scrutiny is here is to discuss the principle of the option agreement. That's not the planning decision because that will come later and that will be subject to its own decision-making processes. And also it's not necessarily all the other decisions that will be taken in relation to this. There will be officer decisions that come forward under this delegation from Cabinet that members will have the right to see. They'll be published in the forward plan because they'll be key. So there'll be other points for members to consider whether they want to discuss or have any input again. There were comments made by the speakers in relation to this being open land, and you'll see in the papers, open space, you'll see in the papers before you, this is not designated as open space. There's therefore no requirement on the council to consult in terms of statutory. And then there are very separate obligations in terms of consultation based in common law. But again, it's very specific circumstances in which those arise. So there was no requirement in this case for any consultation to be undertaken. And obviously unless and until planning is secure, there's no ability for the land to change its use. So it remains open space. So this agreement doesn't affect that change in its status. The buyer could in fact apply for planning permission regardless of this contract. Then the planning process, yep, it will be usual. It will be subject to consultation. It will be subject to the decision-making processes as usual in terms of going to committee, etc. potentially. Forgive me, I don't know the entire scheme of delegation, but I imagine it will end up at committee or through call-in. And that will be advertised as is usual, and comments will be able to be submitted by the public and by members in relation to the planning application. That's all I have to say on this.
Thank you, Emma. Jane's got her hand up. So Jane, would you like to add to that, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, I feel slightly as if my work here is done because Emma gave such a good response to the various questions. I think I just wanted to underline that this is the council as landowner entering into a transaction that is perfectly normal under these circumstances, and it's using its land efficiently and protecting value that could be used for council services.
Thank you very much, Jane. Do we have any other questions that have arisen? Councillor Khan, I've got some as well.
What is the status of these fields under the local plan? I mean, are they there as a status 3-point-something acre for educational and 8-point-something acre for the residential? Is that what the local plan, which is also in air at the moment? So wanted to know if any officers know what are the status of these fields in the local plan, which obviously been gone through all the public consultation and inspectors are not happy with it.
Thank you. And Councillor Martino's got a follow-up.
Are we not sort of straying on to talking about planning when we're talking about that? Surely that will come.
It's not planning, there's the plan, local plan, which talks about a lot of lands, not about the planning
Yeah.
application.
I'm just a bit
Thank
worried
you.
that we are
I will
heading
just take
towards.
advice on this from Emma Jackman. Just are we straying into planning territory, or is this okay to discuss?
Yeah, so the local plan hasn't been adopted, as you know, and you know that the inspectors recommended that it's withdrawn. As yet, any decisions to be taken on that. However, at the moment, it has therefore very limited weight in planning terms, and we are straying into whether it's a planning consideration. So what I would say is, for the purpose of the option agreement, it's not relevant. For the purpose of any planning decision, it will depend on its status at the time, and also that will be a matter to be determined by full council.
Thank you, Emma, for that clarification. I have a question around just in terms of at what point would scrutiny be able to see any kind of draft terms for an options agreement? Just the not all the technical details, but like when you get to a closer stage in that period of developing it. And the other question was came up through the public speaker around the alternatives of having an option agreement with other organisations that might not be this landowner. How does that then get considered in the process of developing option agreement? So there is, it seems, an assumption that this agreement is being drafted with the current owner of the neighbouring land, and so to what extent do you consider whether option agreements could be drawn up with other entities in terms of the use of that land? Thank you.
Do you want to go first, Jane?
Yeah, well, I can go first on the second point, in that, you know, the council using its land efficiently, we cannot see that there will be an alternative, so we haven't sought that. In the, I think, the confidential appendix, Emma, you might need to just kick me under the table and put me right here. I think that the heads of terms from the cabinet report have been released to this committee. And they are quite detailed heads of terms from which the legal agreement would be drafted. If anybody wants to discuss those heads of terms, then I think Emma will need to move into confidential session.
Yeah, we will. And they are set out in the papers. What I'd also say about the options with various different people, the council has a duty in terms of what it achieves for its land disposal value. And obviously, it does that on the basis of offers that may be made to it. Now, regardless of who the proposed purchaser might be, it is a offer that's come forward that our property team, as the professional valuers, have deemed to be in the best interest of the council to accept based on the terms that are put in the agreement. Obviously, if someone were to offer 3 times that amount, then they'd reconsider before they offered into the option agreement. But that's highly unlikely, given that it's no developer's likely to pay over the odds for what the land is going to be worth once developed. In relation to the draft terms, you've obviously got the draft terms attached. What I would say is, ordinarily, and this is within the constitution as well, members are not entitled to see draft agreements when they're being negotiated. It's not something that we should, simply because the negotiation of those documents is so commercially sensitive often, and also so very delicate, because you'll have disagreement on certain clauses, that it's usually kept extremely closely to those officers just involved in that being the instructing officers and the solicitors. So they're not ordinarily shared, and in fact, the constitution does reflect that documents in negotiation are not accessible outside of members of the cabinet.
Unless anyone else has got anything to come back on, I just have a clarification on that last point. So if it's not, there's not a member entitlement to see it sort of while they're being negotiated, is there a period sort of once that negotiation has taken place and it's been agreed, but before anything is signed, where there is an option for any kind of review beyond the cabinet members? I just would like to understand to the request that we got from the floor from our public speaker around, can something be released without the value? Could you answer that question? And at what, if it is possible or feasible at any point, at what moment would that be feasible without the value? So that we can answer the public speaker's question, please. Thank you.
So the agreement of the terms is delegated to officers, so it will be officers leading the negotiation in accordance with that delegation. Until they are signed, they are in draft, and therefore the provisions of the Constitution apply. Once signed, then and if it were FOI, that same caveat would apply to any request. We wouldn't release draft documentation in negotiation. The problem being that documentation can change, and release of it too prematurely can affect the negotiations around the deal and in fact the realization of a deal. However, post entering into the option, then FOI would, the exemption in terms of draft and the restriction on councillors in terms of draft would drop away, and then subject to redaction and review for commercial sensitivity, it would be available to under FOI and to councillors with appropriate redactions in place.
Thank you. Jane?
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to add that it's, I don't quite want to use the word simplistic, but this is not just looking at the actual consideration as being the thing that might become commercially sensitive. There will be a lot behind that really plays into it. So it's not just a question of we'll take the number out and there you go.
Yeah, if I could add to that, to give an example. So, for example, let's say there was a timeline around development that could be useful to competitors also looking to develop the same type of properties in a similar sort of area. If there were any provisions regarding what arrangements they might need for access or other sorts of easements, that would also be commercially sensitive. It could give their competitors an edge, or it could inflate additional prices that they may have to pay. So it's not just the value that's commercially sensitive. Jane's quite right. It's the wider detail within it that can also be caught by that.
Okay, thank you. So, so just to summarise, what I think we've heard here is that basically, other than the principle of there being an option agreement, where it is not actually possible for beyond the limited headers that we've seen as scrutiny members, for there to be at any point a more detailed version of the options agreement released at any point until it is actually signed. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And so for us as scrutiny, it's we have to decide whether or not we feel that is acceptable, but or not. But this is just the way that things are done. And if we have any recommendations around changing that process, we would. Can I just clarify? Would we hit the same legal barriers that things wouldn't be able to be released because of this commercial sensitivity? Is that basically, is there any option at all for any greater degree of transparency around details of any option agreement than what we have now?
So you would be able to see it once it's been entered into. As I said, it wouldn't be in draft then, though it wouldn't necessarily be made public in its entirety, and that would be subject to councillors' obligations regarding confidentiality. Jane is going to dislike me for saying this, so I do apologise, Jane. But obviously, once the officer decision to enter into this agreement is going to be key, that means it is subject to call-in. So if you wish to look at it again before the officers put pen to paper, and that will be very close, then that is a point at which scrutiny could look at this again if they wish to. Now, as to what exists and what can be shared at that point publicly into councillors, I can't say because it doesn't exist at this present time, but that would be another option if scrutiny did want to look at this again further before officers exercise their delegated powers.
Thank you. And so just to clarify, the officer decision that you're referring to is that an option agreement would be being proceeded with. Is that
entered into? So it'll be the decision to enter into the negotiated contract. So just to get technical and explain why, that's what legal would need in order to put pen to paper on the contract. So it's the final, we've reached an agreement, we're now going to enter into it and commit to the agreement, and that will be the officer decision.
And Jane, I do note your hand, but just at that point, how do wider members, in terms of process, how are they made aware that that trigger is happening? Just so that we understand.
So as with any key decision, it will be placed on the forward plan 28 days in advance of it being taken. And then likewise, it will be subject to a 3-day call-in period once the decision's been made, and then notified in the normal way as with this one.
Thank
clear working days, so just
yeah.
correction.
Two
Clear working days.
Okay, just to clarify, 2 clear working days. Thank you very much. And Jane, I noticed that your hand's still here, so please go ahead with your point.
Yeah, I mean, just to put a bit of sort of reality into the decision making process, I suppose, you know, the heads of terms have been seen, and they are the principal heads of terms. There will be lots of bits around that, but I suspect that we won't move far from those original heads of terms that have been seen in the confidential appendix.
And just to add, the heads of terms are the primary matters that the parties are concerned about ordinarily. So when we say negotiating the agreement, that fixes the principal things that everybody's concerned about from the outset. And then we're talking about the more nitty-gritty of how it will operate that will be negotiated.
And just want, so that we're fully clear in the room, the heads of terms that also can't, if the value was removed, they also can't, regardless, they can't be disclosed at this point, just so that we're 100% clear.
No, for the same reason, they would be commercially sensitive in terms of the detail within there.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've exhausted this line of clarification. There was this issue around loss of space in the designation in the local plan. Whilst it's not a planning matter, have we got any questions around that from anyone on the floor? Just
ask, to be honest, I know it's not going to be looking polite. I don't understand why we are here. What are we scrutinizing? We can't see the optional agreement because of the legal barriers. It can't be seen until the cabinet is enter into that agreement. Is the cabinet decision, which is the gang of 10 makes decisions, and rest of council and councillors or the cabinet or the scrutiny doesn't have much of say on this. So yes, I know it was call-in, it was to air some of things, but there's no tangible anything I can see from this meeting, and therefore coming in this rain, I find not useful coming into the meeting where you don't have any teeth to bite anything. You just are scared because of the law and legal and all that sort of things. So I am a bit disappointed about the whole process. That might be the constitutional or democratic process needed to be looked at, and the scrutiny must have some role. Scrutinizing is not just listening to the legal, the process and the cabinet is there making decisions, and as Thatcher said, her cabinet is making decision and people are there to make a protest. So that sort of approach is here.
Thank you. So I think Councillor Tino's got a point, and then I think we've moved actually into discussion rather than question of the officers at this point. So just for framing our discussion, and I think there are these different issues that we might want to discuss in turn before we come up with any recommendations if we choose to. But Councillor Tino, I think this is more.
I mean, from what I've heard from the officers today and what I've read, I am fully confident that they have done this professionally and that they have presumably advised the cabinet, and therefore there is nothing that we would want to recommend about this specific decision to enter into an option agreement. It seems to me it's been done professionally, appropriate. I have full confidence in them. I feel pretty confident ongoing about what may happen if a planning application is. And from when I've been to planning committee meetings, I've been very impressed by the planning officers and by the members who sit on the planning committee, that they would do, you know, things fairly and professionally. So I would just like to express my confidence in their decision that they've made and the way they've behaved, presented this and written this report.
Thank you, Councillor Ottino. Would anyone else like to comment on this issue of conflict of interest, which I think is one of the main reasons that we're discussing this, whether there has been any conflict of interest? I think Councillor Ottino has suggested his view that that he doesn't think that there has been, and that appropriate safeguards are in place to ensure that there is satisfactory separation between the legal the planning aspects of this and then the council's role as a landowner. So on the conflict of interest, is everyone satisfied that that has sufficiently been addressed? Yeah. Okay. So to summarise, on that point, there is sufficient confidence there. So it's really just to note that in the records that that is sufficiently addressed. The options period, just on this point, because I know that that was one of the main points of concern around the length of the options period, and also the point of which scrutiny or full council get to see the draft terms. As we've heard, we can see the headers. We have seen that in the confidential documents, which are not to be shared beyond this, but then we've also heard how we can also look again at this in terms of the scrutiny process when the officer decision is noted in the forward plan to take forward this negotiation phase of the contract and call in that. So any points of concern around the options duration that you want to raise from what we've heard from residents and our speakers today? So I think on this point, I'm not hearing anyone, but I do want to note, I think it's important for the record that, you know, we are, that these concerns have been raised about the duration of the option agreement, and therefore it is important that we are informed, I think, when that officer decision is going to be made. So there is that opportunity for at least the scrutiny at that point, even if there is a limit of the degree of the scrutiny that can take place. As we've heard, we've been, and we've got Councillor Turner who has joined the meeting. Welcome, Councillor Turner. We're on discussing the duration of the options period, which was a matter of concern. Anybody want to add anything about, ask even Councillor Turner, anything on the duration of the agreement? It is in our paper. So what I would like to at least table to satisfy the concerns of the residents that have raised in this process, which is that there should just be some, we should be alerted to the fact that that decision is going to be preceded by the officer, in case there is anyone that wants to raise concern at that stage around the further processing of the options period, because clearly there are concerns there. I'm not sure that there's anything more we can do. The only thing that I would say is that we will have that available post it being signed as well. There is that opportunity. Yeah. So do we have any recommendations, or could we put forward recommendations that once it is signed, it could be some of the details could be made available on request if needed? Is that something worth? No, we can't do that. We can't. Yeah, they'd have that. So there's nothing that we could add to that. No. Okay. So then anything beyond the duration? No. Okay, so we move on to the loss of space. We have been informed that we have to be careful in going into further detail around loss of space because of it being a planning matter and the planning designation, anyone got any questions or clarifications or anything you want to discuss around that concern that has been raised? Yeah, Councillor Ottino, please.
I mean, again, I've got full confidence that this will be looked at planning. That, you know, planning isn't just applications aren't just approved willy-nilly, are they? They look into these matters. So I don't see any reason why we should worry about that now. I think our planning officers are very impressive, and so are our members on the planning committee, some of whom are here. So I feel confident that these issues will be scrutinised at that committee, and that's the relevant time to do it.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else like to add to this point around loss of space? I think one concern I would like to raise around this, and maybe it's just the fact that the local plan, there may be a gap in the local plan in 2026 because of it having been turned down. Does that present any risks to the council and therefore the options agreement related to this? Because would it be that that land could be developed on because there is no local plan and no designation for that? Emma, please, could you clarify that point?
Yeah, so obviously, as to what happens with the forward plan is a decision that will come before council. So we don't know what the position will be in terms of the local plan going forward. That said, just very briefly to explain planning, if something isn't a site identified for a purpose in the local plan, it doesn't mean that it will definitely or will not at all get planning permission. What still happens is that the application will be considered against all relevant planning considerations, and a determination will be made by officers against all the various national policies, local policies that are relevant. The absence of any site's allocation within the local plan simply just means that there isn't a specific policy in relation to it. However, the remainder of planning policy and other planning considerations continue to apply. So it would just be determined by the planning committee and by planning officers in line with the legal framework for assessing planning applications, whether or not there is a designation in the local plan.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. And there is just a related question around then this tiny forest that was mentioned. Is there a role that scrutiny can play? And this is, Emma, a question to you in providing any recommendations that the council's decision making for relocating or replacing this to an alternative location, if indeed planning was to look at that, or is that completely out of scope of what we're able to mention or raise as scrutiny?
It's not a matter for cabinet, and obviously you're scrutinising a cabinet decision at present. It is, however, a matter of planning committee. So if an application were to come forward to it, they would look at loss of open space, green space, habitat, etc., and there would be requirements regarding replacement. So it's very much a matter that will be dealt with by planning, and it's not directly relevant to this agreement, which is about the option agreement that the cabinet's agreeing to enter into.
Okay. Thank you. Would anyone like to reflect on what we've just heard from Emma around the loss of green space? Any of those points? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I have absolute confidence this will be dealt with at planning, and our planning officer seemed impressive, and so does our planning committee. So I don't think we should be talking about this now. That will be covered there and checked and gone over in absolute detail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Councillor Stairs, please.
I'm just a little confused, I suppose, in what feels a bit of a contradiction, that the council is searching for land to build and yet we're selling land, and there's a little confusion for me about why we're selling land.
So just to take that as from Jane, there's a question there for you from Councillor Stairs. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, this is to potentially provide an access to land that we don't own. So yes, where we have land that is developable for housing, obviously with the housing company, we do look at that, but this is not land that we own.
May I just add a clarification around the options agreement and where you're making these agreements for where there are trees that clearly would be impacted by an options agreement if it were to be brought forward, regardless of the planning decision. Is there ever scope for you to put clauses within the options agreement around sort of requiring the developer, if they do bring forward the land that you're creating that access to be taking into account the relocation of some of the biodiversity or the trees that might have to be removed for the purposes of providing that access?
Ted, it's over to you.
We could look to discuss that with them. I understand informally that Ruskin have already looked at how they would deal with that forest in the event they triggered the option.
You know, and alternatively, we have land that we could reprovide.
Thank you. Would anyone like to come in on this? Because I have a point just to come back to on that, just as to summarise. Okay, I can't see any other points being made related to this, but what I would like to maybe suggest and see what others think is whether we could encourage that there is a clause that refers to any loss of these trees in any future options agreement such as this, so that we can ensure that there is consistency within our council policies around the reforestation of the city or urban canopy and the agreements that we are making in terms of development. I know that planning policies will to some extent deal with the site, but just ensuring that we're using the leverage that we have in that options agreement to be able to do that. So I'd like to just ask whether others would feel satisfied if we could put that as a recommendation forward.
Isn't routinely this dealt with at planning committee? If when there was an application that a tree may be cut down, part of the decision is made about possibly planting trees elsewhere, or maybe not allowing the application on that basis. So I think this is all covered at the planning committee. I don't think we should be interfering with them, and I've absolutely confidence in them.
Just to, I think we've got Emma's got her hand raised on this. Just to clarify my point, it's not around this specific example, but it's around a recommendation that options agreements do consider this aspect. It's not requiring any details in the actual planning application itself, but it's leveraging our kind of influence as the landowner or the in that commercial relationship, which is something that can be done. Emma, would you like to come in on this and clarify for us?
Yeah, so it's not something that is an absolute no, but what I would say is it is really a planning matter, and anything in the planning space would trump what was necessarily within a private agreement, because planning is going to have very stringent requirements on replacement for biodiversity net gain and green provision, etc., because of the policies around that. So if something were to be recommended, it's very likely it's going to pay deference to that planning determination, and you'd have that flexibility in it, because ultimately what you don't want to do is place something on the land through the option agreement that makes it more difficult to develop, when in actual fact the planning authority are content with what's been provided in any given application.
Thank you for that advice. So that is suggesting that it's not necessary. Okay, would anyone else like to come in on this point at all around the loss of land and how we can leverage our influence as a council through our options agreement? No. So at that point, then I think we are through our main discussions. Would you like to summarise, Celeste, what you think we have agreed on this? I think it's more that we've noted rather than a formal recommendation on this, so thank you.
Sorry, just to refer to Constitution Part 17.17. So the Scrutiny Committee, in relation to this call-in decision, can support the decision, which can then be acted on immediately, or send the decision back with comments to Cabinet, which will ultimately make the final decision, or make recommendations to Council on the decision that the changes the budget or policy framework, which I believe Emma has already touched on. But those are the three options that the committee can make tonight.
Okay. So I think then, just as we sum up, then we have to come up with a framing of words based on those three options. And based on what I'm hearing from everyone tonight is that they support the decision that the Cabinet made. Is that right? But
No,
with the
it's
Cabinet,
not right. We haven't voted on that. There is one person keeps saying he's fully confident and support the Cabinet decision. So the others defer. So there was no option of whether we support Cabinet decision or not. There's no recommendation on the report either, whether we agree or disagree. We just looked at, we just asked, we were present. I don't think, apart from that, there is much into this. And there is no many other options here. There is a lot of things being discussed. Our planning matter, which is we haven't got the planning application, and we are separating two decisions. One which is the executive decision, and I don't think the officers or anybody suggested anything or you put anything to us to vote for. So I would content. I'm not supporting the executive's decision or the Cabinet decision.
so then that, in terms of the wording, we've got these three options that the officers have said that before us. So then what we're hearing now is that, that we're not satisfied to, or there's not a unanimous support of the decision, and therefore we would need to vote whether or not we're satisfied. And if we're not satisfied, then note what our course of action is related to the two options that they've put forward.
Chair, may I suggest that rather than taking a vote, because there's no right and left things here, there are some disagreements, there are some agreements, and the report is being discussed, and it is up to the executive to make, or the Cabinet to make the final decision. Is a Cabinet decision, is not the scrutiny decision. So I don't think the voting is appropriate, is the noting is the appropriate that there was some concern and some support.
Okay, Emma, could you come in, please, on this?
So as you've exercised call-in post-decision, you have to exercise one of those two options. The committee needs to decide on one of them tonight. The executive cannot take any further action on it without you having disposed with your call-in. So to dispose with your call-in, you've got the three options. That's on any call-in that you've exercised. So what you will need to do is put forward a proposal as to one of those options and put it to a vote. That's either that you support it, and then it doesn't need to be unanimous, it just needs to be majority, simple majority, or that you put recommendations, but you'll need to work out what those recommendations are. Or the third one is the policy and budget framework, which in reality, I don't think, my advice would be there's nothing coming from this report that would be recommended to council in terms of the budget or policy framework. So I think in reality, your options are to either make recommendations to Cabinet where you feel you've got relevant ones related to the decision, or to support it and allow the decision to be implemented and taken forward. But unfortunately, because of the nature of the call-in in particular, you must reach a decision on this.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Councillor Ortino, please.
I'm going to propose that we support it fully because we haven't come up with any recommendations. So I don't really see what the other alternative is. That's what we should do.
Okay, so for this, do we have a seconder for Councillor Ortino's proposal? Councillor Koyam seconds that.
Yeah.
And okay, can we just get the vote just to clarify, because clearly there wasn't consensus. Do we want to also ask whether Councillor Alpecon has the proposal for an alternative recommendation to vote on?
First vote. We'll need to check Emma's per hand again.
Okay.
You need to go to the first vote that's on the table. Obviously, if that is rejected, then obviously there need to be another proposal. But I think you should bring it in first.
Okay. Emma, please, can you go ahead and advise? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I could hear that, Councillor Miles. So yes, you've got a proposal to seconders. You need to move to the vote. If that fails, then you'll need a second recommendation, but you can't ask for an alternative. You've got to deal with the first proposal and first proposed and seconded motion first.
Okay, so we'll take this to the vote. We've got the Councillor Ortino has put forward and it's seconded by Councillor Koyam to support the decision that has already been made by the Cabinet on this. And so all those in favour, can you please raise your hands? 6, okay. So that carries at 6, but all of those who are against, okay, and so the motion has carried, the recommendation has carried, so there's no further discussion on this, is that correct? Yeah, okay, all right. So I think that closes the decision. So we've the close-in has then been, there was a term used, disposed of based on the voting that has just been taken place by scrutiny. So I'd like to say thank you very much for your time for this meeting, and thank you to our public speakers as well on this matter. Okay, yeah, is that anything else? So thank you to everyone online as well. Thank you for your time.